Good afternoon. Today we'll explore a complex and often controversial aspect of cultural studies, the invention of tradition. We will deconstruct the tension between the popular image of a united ancient culture, largely a product of the 18th century Romantic revival, and the fragmented reality revealed by archaeology. The term Celt is highly problematic. Ancient Greeks and Romans used it as a broad label for various northern groups, viewing them as a homogeneous other. We must question if Celtic refers to a single thing or a collection of objects and remains. Modern scholarship, particularly the Celtic skeptic movement, argues that the concept of Celtic people is a relatively modern linguistic and nationalistic creation rather than an ancient reality. Because there are no internal written record from the Iron Age Celts, we rely on external classical sources or later Christian monastic writings, creating historical void that later movements filled with imagination. To understand why Celtic is a problematic label, we must look at the Hallstatt and La Tène archaeological periods. These eras are often used as shorthand for early Celts, but we must ask what is meant by that. Hallstatt culture, emerging around 800 BC, shows us an intellectual elite with a sophisticated ironwork. Later, the Latinian style introduced the iconic swirling art we often associate with Celtic design. However, the controversy lies in the Celtic label itself. Archaeological evidence reveals that these styles and technologies were traded and adopted across vast region. A person using a Latinian style sword in Britain might have had a completely different language, religion, and a social structure than someone using the same style in Bohemia. This is the core of the Celto-skeptic debate led by scholars like John Collis and Simon James. They both argue that Celt is an artificial umbrella term created by 18th century linguists and applied backward onto history. Archaeology shows us a shared material culture, but it does not prove a single unified Celtic people. By conflating art styles with ethnicity, we risk creating a mystical past that never existed. We must treat these findings as evidence of complex, interconnected societies rather than a single monolithic empire. The medieval scriptorium to see how the Celt was further edited was through the church. There is a common misconception that monks simply saved Celtic myths. In reality, they performed a complex act of cultural synthesis. They used euhemerism, a technique where ancient gods were written as historical humans. In the Labor Gabala Eren, the divine Tuatha De Danann was stripped of their godhood and turned into a group of survivors from a mythical past. This allowed monks to preserve ancestral stories without violating their faith. Consequently, when modern readers look at these medieval manuscripts for pure paganism, what they are actually seeing is a version of history carefully curated by medieval monks. This is a critical, problematic point. Our primary sources for paganism are themselves Christian edits. The invention of tradition truly took hold during the 18th and 19th centuries. These mythical pasts were constructed by poets and antiquarians to serve the risk or the rising nationalist and romantic ideas of the time. Historians Eric Hobsbawm and Terence Ranger defined invented tradition as practices that imply continuity with a real past but are actually recent inventions. A primary example is the United Ancient Order of Druids. These groups were simply reviving ancient secrets. They were creating a mythical man, a virtuous, natural pagan, to contrast with the dirty modern world. This constructed, romanticized view is the very foundation of how the public view Celts today, but it bears little resemblance to the Iron Age tribes found in the archaeological period. This leads us to modern Neopaganism. While these are legitimate new religions, they often claim a direct, unbroken lineage from the Iron Age. However, academic critics argue these practices bear little resemblance to history. Many Neopagans operate through elective affinity, choosing a Celtic identity that fits their worldview. The friction arises when these groups use cafeteria paganism, picking isolated ancient practices out of context to validate their modern beliefs. We must distinguish between what really happened and the ideas synthesized during the Romantic era. Their tradition being practiced today is often a double layered invention, a modern interpretation of a Victorian interpretation of a medieval Christian edit. The issue of historicity feeds into accusation of cultural appropriation. The Celtic identity is merely a personal choice. Practitioners may adopt rituals from closed indigenous practices like ancient animals without truly understanding what those practices are. Furthermore, there is a risk of ignoring the living Celtic communities in Ireland, Scotland, and Wales who have a continuous linguistic and cultural heritage. Critics, most critics ask why appropriate an image or imagine ancient culture when living ones still exist. We should look at how these country people built a blended local sense of identity over centuries. Modern Reconstructionist movements are attempting to solve this by engaging in living cultures and sticking to hard archaeological evidence rather than romantic forgeries. A major controversial aspect is the use of reliable sources. Historians emphasize separating what really happened from imagined histories. Unfortunately, some neo-pagan communities rely on pseudo-scholarship or romantic forgeries. For example, we see how Christian scribes altered Celtic myths to become the epics we have now. If we don't apply academic rigor to these tests, we risk building modern identities on medieval edits rather than ancient truths. Relying on pseudo history does undermine the field and any claims to historical continuity. Finally, the constructed nature of Celtic identity has real world political dangers. Early scholarships often had nationalist biases. In extreme cases today, the idea of a pure Celtic race is exploited by far right organizations to justify exclusionary politics. Groups have used claims to a Celtic ethnicity to support nationalistic agendas and white privilege. Our course asks us to analyze these political constructions critically and synthesize a nuanced understanding of insular identity. We must recognize that the Celtic label has been used as a tool for both libertarian and exclusion, making it one of the most politically charged identities in Western history. In conclusion, navigating Celtic studies requires a critical lens. We must deconstruct how beliefs blend over time, from the Iron Age Isle of Druids to the medieval Isle of Saints. The problematic aspect isn't the modern spiritual practice itself, but the claim of direct historical continuity where none exists. The path forward involves academic rigor, respect for living cultures, and an understanding that traditions are often adapted or invented to suit the needs of the present. By acknowledging these inventions, we get closer to the truth of the people who inhabited these islands. Thank you.